Oh dear. It really went wrong for Keir Starmer this week after he addressed workers at a factory and mentioned Nigel Farage some 16 times.
And I'm speaking out today in relation to Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, Nigel Farage, Nigel Farage, Farage, Nigel 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 Farage.
Embarrassing! Things went from bad to worse. The press, who have historically given him a free ride, which is, I believe, part of the reason why we are where we are, were not pulling any punches.
The speed of the decline in your popularity is historically unprecedented. Isn't this speech today an admission that you have failed and Nigel Farage understands voters better than you?
Reform UK say you're running scared of them, that you're sounding increasingly like them with some of the policies and announcements you've made recently. This is a speech that was very defensive, wasn't it?
The wider issue of the opposition you're now facing, do you think one of the problems is that Nigel Farage can approximate talking like a human being, where you just resort to talking points and dodging questions?
Also, if I may, are you not worried people will ask why you're holding a press conference about Nigel Farage 4 years out from a general election instead of focusing on your plans for the country?
Chris Hope, GBNews. Prime Minister Nigel Farage has 5 MPs, you've got 403. Are you panicking because Reform is so far ahead in the polls, it seems? Is he living rent-free in your brain?
Those are questions from The Guardian, the BBC, Sky, ITV and, of course, GBNews. Nigel, who loves being the centre of attention, responded in kind.
We have Keir Starmer, our socialist Prime Minister, is terrified. Do you know, he mentioned me 16 times today in a speech. I'm living rent-free inside his head.
And latest polling suggests that Nigel is now odds-on favourite to be the next Prime Minister. Yes, I know a lot can happen, but that includes to the Labour Party as well. Even those trying to claim Nigel Farage will be the next Liz Truss haven't managed to put a dent in his popularity.
The cost of net zero to the taxpayer, figures produced by the Institute of Government, are estimated between 2025 and 2030 to cost £45 billion every single year. The cost of asylum seeker accommodation, be it hotels or be it houses of multiple occupancy, as I mentioned earlier, £4 billion every year. That may be a slightly low estimate because actually the overall costs of illegal immigration are much higher. DEI, as researched by Defunding Political Campaigns, estimated to cost government £7 billion every year. Quangos, just a 5% cut. And by the way, do you remember in the general election, we suggested a 5% cut? I mean, you thought, you know, what dreadful people we were. Impossible, it can't be done. And yet the government now proposing a 5% cut. Well, we're proposing a 5% cut to Quango funding, which would over a 5-year term be £65 billion. If you add all that up, you've got a pretty eye-watering number of £350 billion. And whilst that may be, I accept, you know, slightly optimistic, because it's difficult always to cut everything, I think you can see very clearly the direction that we're going in.
Yes, that was Nigel's response when he was asked how is he going to make the savings, or is he going to wave a magic money tree? And given this week's gaffe from Keir Starmer's friend Lord Hermer, who said at the annual security lecture at the Royal United Services Institute that calls for the UK to quit international agreements echoed similar demands by legal experts in the 1930s Germany who rejected international law and human rights in favour of state power. Well, a kind of unwise choice of words if you're seriously comparing people to Nazis, because they simply want to leave an outdated construct that enables paedophiles and criminals from abroad to manipulate the system to avoid deportation. Then you need to have a serious word with yourself, especially if you're banging up people for inciting racial hatred. Then what is that? Lord Hermer, Keir Starmer's Attorney General, with close links to the Chagos deal, has previously represented Saudi Arabian terrorist Mustafa al-Hawsawi on behalf of the human rights charity Redress, and surprise, surprise, he also acted for the human rights organisation Liberty, which was in favour of allowing Shamima Begum leave to enter the UK. This has been a very, very bad week for Sir Keir Starmer, who doesn't appear to understand why the walls are crumbling. So let me spell it out to you, Keir. stop treating the electorate like fools and start listening to what we are saying. You are not above us. You are a public servant working for us, not for yourself. So start answering questions. Stop blaming the previous government. We know they were useless. In fact, they were so bad that you slipped under the radar. So fix the things that we need you to fix, like illegal migration and high taxation. Otherwise, you will be fixed into the foundations of history as the worst Prime Minister this country has ever had the misfortune to endure. Right, 12 minutes after 4 o'clock. Before we get stuck into the debate, here's what else is coming up today. For the Great British Debate this hour, I'm asking, is Sir Keir Starmer obsessed with Nigel Farage? He mentioned him 16 times in a speech earlier this week, but is he not better off trying to run the country properly? Then for the Great British Debate this hour, I'm asking, who do you trust more with the economy, Labour or Reform UK? The Prime Minister says that Mr Farage would be Liz Truss all over again, Liz Truss 2.0. But the Reform leader was very much disagrees. We'll be debating that. All of that on the way. As ever, send me your thoughts, post your comments, gbnews.com/your say. Well, joining me now to discuss in the studio, former editor of the Labour List, Peter Edwards. Peter, am I totally out of order? Am I totally wrong?
There's a lot there I disagree with, and I want to pick up on one particular thing, which is, should the Prime Minister attack other politicians? Yes, I'd say Nigel Farage has escaped scrutiny for a long time. And one particular point this week, Reform, led by Farage, pledged to reverse the government's cuts to the winter fuel allowance. I found that mind-boggling. Nigel Farage is a lifelong Thatcherite, pledged to a smaller state, yet at the 11th hour he's had this conversion to the cause of social security that the left has defended for 100 years. It is beyond nonsense. It would be laughable, were it not so serious, for Nigel Farage to try and defend the welfare state in that way.
Well, maybe he's seeing that we really need to be encouraging people to have children in this country, ultimately, really, because we have a declining population and we don't want to be just simply relying on imported labour. So perhaps he's seeing the economics and looking at the situation and realising, actually, we should be encouraging people to have more kids.
Well, he made a range of policies, and yeah, you're covering a different one. I was talking about winter fuel for pensioners,
okay,
but
let's talk
he's trying
fuel,
to incentivise
well, let's talk winter fuel,
marriage
yes.
tax break and so on and so on. I mean, Reform's economic proposals don't add up. It's estimated by the IFS that it's 50 to 80 billion pounds to fulfil all the promises made this week. At the general election, when Reform only got 5 MPs, the IFS, who are not party political, said their plans were a work of fiction.
Well, OK, let me see if you can do the math on this then, because Keir Starmer, if you're saying that the Labour Party have got good at maths, I'm just trying to make the Chagos deal equal 3.4 billion, which is how much he said it would cost. Remember, it's a deal for 99 years for 110 million a year. That worked out, even with no inflation index linked or anything like that, that worked out at 9,999 million. I couldn't get it to 3.4. So if what he is proposing is fantasy economics, then what is that?
Well, there are people who write whole PhDs on future assumptions around inflation. My understanding is there is some expectations or assumptions made around inflation in that deal. I think the Chagos deal...
Well, yes, that it would at some point be index-linked, which would then mean, and as you know, inflation is prices rising, wages lagging behind. Inflation doesn't often go below zero, so it's usually the price inflated by a certain... We're talking about how high it's inflated. It's always inflating. So what I'm saying is that Chagos deal, without any inflation, without any index-linked inflation, I know part of the deal is linked, index-linked, there is no way of making that equal 3.4 billion, and we've all tried it. So if what Nigel is doing is fantasy economics, I'm just not going to ask you again, what is that from the Labour Party?
What my concern is different. I'm conscious, I don't want this to be an economics seminar on a very hot Saturday afternoon.
But you pointed out that Nigel Farage, this is fantasy economics from Nigel Farage, and you mentioned a very important financial body who have looked at that.
The Institute for Fiscal Studies, who are not party political.
Yes, that's right. You've mentioned them. So I'm just literally listening to that saying, fair enough, make the Chagos deal add up.
The Chagos deal, I think the deal had to be done. My worry is actually China view it as positive. There was a court ruling. Britain, whoever won the election, couldn't just say, we'll ignore Chagos, not deal with it. But I have some concerns, I think as many do, about Mauritius coming under the ambit of Chinese influence. China is not our friend. You know, they do things, especially in the cyberspace, that are hostile to Britain.
Yeah.
So that's my worry, really.
Well, that's true, and that was
we
the
don't
week,
know yet. But
that
the
was the week before. That was Keir Starmer the week before. So that was another thing that he signed quite hastily, I think, in my view. The week before, I remember a Thursday, I was on air, and I was very disappointed that should be happening. But hey, it happened. He signed it, so we're potentially giving it away, and the sums don't add up at all.
But
so
no.
Again, fantasy economics.
But in your monologue, you suggested, in a, I thought, totally overblown way, he could be one of the worst prime ministers. I think I'm in the Labour Party. Labour have done a lot of things. So set up GB Energy. They've put more money into the NHS. NHS waiting lists are starting to come down. They're beginning, I think, to perhaps flatten the curve a bit on net zero, so move towards a green economy, but understand businesses might need a bit more flexibility. I think we've got a sensible Home Secretary in Yvette Cooper, which I'm sure you'd agree, under the Tories, we had a lot of Home Secretaries in a couple of years.
Listen,
and it was chaotic.
They were a disaster.
We're deporting more foreign criminals than we were.
Well, you say that. A lot of them are going voluntarily, and we are importing even more. So
well, how do you know that? What's the basis for that?
Well, the basis of that is that we've got 400, 500 people coming here illegally. So the fact they come here illegally, I think it's today, already in small boats, they're criminals.
That doesn't substantiate
what
you're saying.
Well, that does substantiate it, yes. So I'm saying that they may be deporting quite more than the previous government, but what I'm saying is these people, there's more and more of them coming.
Investment
in fact, let's
in the
talk
NHS,
about the numbers
GB Energy, deporting more foreign criminals. I think these are good things.
It depends if you're doing it as a net number or whether you're just doing it as an overall number, because the way I'm seeing it is if you add up the people who are coming in and then you deduct it from the people that you say that you're deporting, you'll probably find out that actually it's less.
We don't know. And the reality is that we can go back and forth on figures, but we're fewer than 12 months into a Labour government, so we just don't have the numbers yet.
Well, no, we don't, but we're fewer than 12 months in, and we've already had record-breaking numbers of people coming to this country via small boat. And Keir Starmer did promise that he was going to have this border force command control that would help stop this. And so
they've appointed a new leader of that new organisation.
So they're just moving the deck chairs around, putting somebody else there.
No.
So they just put somebody in, that's it.
Setting up a new task force, a leader's been appointed. But I think we all know the border system was a little bit chaotic. Do you think it can be turned around in 6 or 9 months, or do you think it needs a few years? Because my view is the latter.
Well, it could have been done a lot more swiftly if they'd kept Rwanda, because that was a deterrent. But now they're looking for third-party countries to take on migrants because they've realised that they've destroyed the option of a deterrent, which is what Rwanda was. You could have done that and the other thing, but for some reason he felt that he was
Rwanda was a work of fiction, Anna. The number of people
it wasn't a work of fiction. There was actually houses and places built in Rwanda for people who had come to this country and who had nowhere else to go if we decided that we didn't want them.
I thought the Rwanda scheme was not just totally impractical, I thought it was wrong on principle and it's a stain upon our nation. And I visited Rwanda.
A stain upon our nation?
Yes, I visited Rwanda, and I think it's totally improper for Britain to outsource its obligations to a very deprived country that's having a very slow recovery from genocide.
Well, you're investing into the country, aren't you, if you're putting money into it? Otherwise, I mean, if we're going to talk about, how good we are and how then why is Ed Miliband? Let's go to him then, net zero, who's quite happy to buy solar panels from China, where we know these have been made by slaves. And he was on the radio saying, oh, well, if we have to, we have to. I heard him.
Well, he didn't say that. I mean,
well, it was roughly that. I mean, these aren't these exact words, but he was prepared to do that, and he knew about it. He was told about it. It was on Nick Ferrari on LBC.
Look, modern slavery is an evil. We can all agree on that.
Slavery is slavery.
Whether left or right, modern slavery is an evil. And I think human dignity and human suffering are much bigger things than solar panels. But I think we've all got to be honest with ourselves. In my mobile phone, I don't know where the chips in that mobile phone came from, and it's very hard for me as a layperson to find out.
Exactly, but when you do know, when you do know where they're coming from, when you do know the solar panels are coming from migrant labour or sort of slave labour, which we do know, and Ed Miliband admitted he did know, then you shouldn't be allowing it. And thankfully, there are people who... Well, that's because he was forced to stop. But that's the point I'm making. They're acting so pious as though they're so good and everything. It turns out they're just as bad, if not worse.
No, I think that's nonsense. First of all, the Conservative government was chaos, and you had row after row, people fighting among themselves.
You won't find me arguing against that. I agree.
And jockeying for position. We also had austerity that I think was avoidable.
Caused by the previous government that the Conservatives were trying to fix.
After COVID, we all know what a global financial crisis is, but we had a global financial crisis in 2008. And, you know, I was a financial journalist at the time, writing about that every day.
I remember I was in a property I was in properties and working around properties where where the subprime fiasco was a nightmare. But again, you can't... This is the thing. People suddenly say, oh, it's nothing to do with us. It's a global thing when there's a problem. But if it was good, they'd be saying, oh, it's down to us.
I think that's being a grown-up. I mean, I would always defend the role of Gordon Brown in a global financial crisis. He
sold all the gold.
He brought world leaders together to stop a recession turning into a depression. And actually, Gordon Brown would admit that he was not fluent at communications. He struggled at times. But history books are judging him differently now to 20 years ago. The global financial crisis, he led Britain's response, and huge action on child poverty.
OK, well, we'll give him the child action, the poverty stuff, and that's great. But right now, we're looking down the abyss, and it looks to me like the Labour Party and the Labour government are part of it. Peter Edwards, thank you very much.